I planned to surprise my mother-in-law with a dream trip to Paris. I even learned French to help her navigate. At the farewell party, she toasted, "Let's hope she doesn't embarrass us abroad." I raised my glass and replied in fluent French, "Embarrassment runs in the family." When I first came up with the idea, it felt almost too good to be true. I'd been married to Vincent for over a decade, and in that time, I'd learned that one of the biggest challenges in my life wasn't my own husband, but his mother, Simone. She wasn't a bad person, but she had this way of making me feel like I was never quite enough. At first, it wasn't so noticeable. But over the years, subtle remarks here and there had built up, and it became clear that no matter what I did, I was never going to win her approval. Vincent and I had our share of disagreements, of course. Every couple does. But nothing compared to the way Simone would sometimes make me feel small. It wasn't the kind of overt hostility you'd expect, nothing that would have been easy to call out, but more the type of comment that leaves you questioning yourself long after you've heard it. I've always tried my best to be a good daughter-in-law. I kept the peace, smiled when I felt awkward, and went along with whatever Simone thought was best for Vincent. But deep down, I wanted something more than just being the okay one in her eyes. That's when the idea hit me. I'd surprise her with a trip to Paris. Not just any trip, though. This would be something special. Simone had always mentioned that Paris was the city of her dreams, but for some reason, she'd never been able to go. Her life had been full of responsibilities, and travel wasn't something she'd had the opportunity to prioritize. When I thought about it, I realized that I could give her something she had always wanted, but I could also turn it into an opportunity for us to bond, for us to connect in a way we hadn't before. There was just one problem: I didn't speak French fluently. Sure, I knew the basics, enough to get by on a trip to a French cafe or shop. But I didn't want to just get by. I wanted to impress her. I wanted her to see me in a different light, not as the small-town girl from the countryside, but as someone who could stand on her own in the heart of Paris, the city of sophistication. So, I signed up for a language course. Every day after dropping the kids off at school, I sat down with my textbooks, practicing phrases over and over again. I listened to podcasts, watched French films, and even hired a tutor for private lessons. It was exhausting, but I was determined. This trip would be perfect. I had planned everything: the flights, the hotel near Montmartre, a private tour of the Louvre, reservations at the best restaurants, and a sunset cruise on the Seine. When the day finally came, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and dread. The moment I told Vincent about my plans, he seemed hesitant. He loved the idea of going to Paris, of course, but he didn't think his mother would take too kindly to it. Simone was the kind of person who liked to be in control of everything, and this surprise wasn't exactly something she'd be able to control. But despite Vincent's doubts, I pushed forward. I booked the tickets. I told Simone. It was a Sunday afternoon when I handed her the letter. She sat there, staring at it for a few moments before looking up at me with raised eyebrows. "Paris?" she asked, her tone flat. "Yes," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. "I've planned a trip for us. I thought it would be something special." Simone didn't immediately react, but the tension in the room was thick. She glanced down at the letter again and then back at me. "Well, I suppose that's thoughtful," she finally said, her voice cool. I forced a smile, but inside, I was feeling a bit deflated. The words had not been the enthusiastic reaction I'd hoped for, but I was determined to make this work. We flew to Paris a few weeks later. And from the moment we stepped off the plane, things didn't go exactly as planned. Simone wasn't openly hostile, but she was critical, in that way she always was. We arrived at the hotel, and before we even set our bags down, she was telling me how I could have picked a more upscale place. The bistro I had chosen for our first dinner wasn't authentic enough in her opinion. I was starting to wonder if I'd made a huge mistake. But then, I remembered something: I had worked hard for this. I had worked hard on learning French. I wasn't going to let Simone's critiques ruin this for me. So, I put on a smile, made my best attempt at French, and did my best to steer things back on track. Each day, I'd point out something exciting we could do: an afternoon walking through the Luxembourg Gardens, a visit to the Musée d'Orsay, and I'd get us reservations at places Simone had only dreamed about. And I tried. I really did. I tried to be the perfect host, the perfect daughter-in-law, and I even practiced my French on her. At least that part seemed to impress her. For a few minutes here and there, I could tell she was a little less skeptical, a little more appreciative. But no matter how hard I tried, there was this underlying tension. One evening, at a restaurant overlooking the Eiffel Tower, she looked at me and said, "I just hope you don't embarrass me here. You're not exactly fluent in French, you know." I didn't respond right away. I felt that familiar sting, but it was different this time. I had worked hard to make this trip everything she wanted, and now, after everything, she was still treating me like I was beneath her. It was the last straw. The final night of our trip arrived. We had a farewell dinner at a beautiful little restaurant near the Seine. Simone stood up to make a toast. As she raised her glass, her eyes met mine. "Let's hope she doesn't embarrass us abroad," she said, with a small, almost amused smile. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Everyone around the table fell silent. And then, I did something I hadn't planned for. Without hesitation, I stood up, raised my glass, and said, in perfect French, "Embarrassment runs in the family." There was a pause. Simone's eyes widened, and the rest of the table was silent, watching the exchange unfold. The look on Simone's face was priceless. She wasn't prepared for it. No one was. I wasn't the small-town girl she thought I was. I wasn't someone who would just take her condescension anymore. Simone quickly regained her composure, offering a tight smile. "Well, I suppose that was unexpected." I simply nodded, taking a sip of my wine. The tension between us had shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. That night, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Even though the trip wasn't perfect, I had finally stood up for myself. It wasn't about proving anything to Simone anymore, it was about proving something to myself. I had fought for this trip, I had put in the effort, and I had learned French to make it happen. And for once, I didn't let her diminish that. We still had our differences, of course. Simone wasn't suddenly going to become my best friend. But from that moment on, I knew I had earned a bit of respect in her eyes, even if she wouldn't admit it. And that felt like a win. As the trip continued, Simone's coldness lingered in the background, but I noticed a slight change in how she interacted with me. It wasn't dramatic. There were no heartfelt apologies or declarations of newfound respect. But the comments, the little digs she used to throw at me, like how I didn't know enough about wine or how I should have picked a different hotel, became less frequent. I don't know if it was because I had pushed back in that moment or if she just realized that I wasn't going to be intimidated anymore, but something had shifted. We spent the next couple of days visiting the major sites: the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame. Simone still commented on the things she didn't like, but there was a small flicker of warmth in her voice when she spoke to me. And when I asked if she wanted to take a boat cruise down the Seine, she didn't hesitate to say yes. It was a quiet evening on that boat, the lights of Paris sparkling all around us, when Simone looked at me and said something I didn't expect. "This city, it's everything I imagined," she said softly, almost to herself. She leaned against the side of the boat, her eyes on the glittering waters. "Thank you for bringing me here." I didn't know how to respond at first. This wasn't the Simone I had grown used to, the one who always found something to criticize. But at that moment, she seemed almost vulnerable. Like she was seeing me for the first time, not just as Vincent's wife but as a person with her own dreams and ambitions. I smiled, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I'm glad you like it," I said, my voice gentle. After a few moments of silence, Simone turned to me. "You really tried, didn't you?" I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I wanted this trip to be something special for you." She studied me for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "I can see that." For the first time in our years of knowing each other, I felt like Simone wasn't just tolerating me, she was recognizing me. Maybe not as a friend, but as someone who was worthy of respect. That moment didn't fix everything. We didn't suddenly become best friends. But I felt like, at that moment, I had earned something. I had earned her acknowledgement. The rest of the trip passed in a quieter, more subdued way. Simone was still Simone. There were moments of sharp criticism, moments where I'd feel that sting in my chest. But there were also moments where I caught her looking at me with something like understanding. It wasn't much, but it was progress. One morning, just before we were about to leave, I asked Simone if she wanted to visit a small cafe I had read about. It was tucked away in the Murray district, a quiet little place with an old-world charm. Simone agreed, and we walked there together. When we arrived, the cafe was exactly as I'd imagined. Cozy, with just a few tables outside, surrounded by trees and little shops. We sat down at a table near the window, and for the first time during the trip, it was just the two of us in silence, watching the world go by. I ordered us coffee, and Simone said something unexpected. "You know, I've always thought I knew what was best for Vincent," she began, her voice distant. "I thought I knew what kind of woman he should be with, what kind of life he should have. But he made his choices, and I suppose they were the right ones after all." I was taken aback. She had never said anything like this to me before. I paused, unsure of what to say. "Thank you. I've always tried to do my best for your son and for our family." Simone gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I know you have." She then took a sip of her coffee and added, "I never gave you enough credit for that. For trying, I mean." It was a small admission, but it felt like a victory. I knew things between Simone and me would never be perfect. We didn't need to be best friends, and we didn't need to agree on everything. But hearing those words, after everything, made me feel like I had finally broken through. Maybe we'd never be close, but we didn't need to be enemies either. The next morning, we packed our bags and made our way to the airport. As we waited for our flight, I could feel the tension that had existed between us slowly dissipating. It wasn't gone entirely, but it wasn't as sharp. Simone didn't have anything more to say, but I knew. The trip had changed something. And though I wasn't sure what it was yet, I knew that I had stood my ground. As we boarded the plane and settled into our seats, Vincent turned to me with a grin. "So, how'd it go?" he asked. I glanced at Simone, who was staring out of the window, her face unreadable. Then, I turned back to Vincent. "I think it went well," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. Vincent raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but said nothing more. Simone didn't speak, but as the plane took off and we soared into the sky, I felt something shift inside me. I had spent years trying to earn Simone's approval, constantly feeling like I was never enough. But Paris, in a way, had freed me. I didn't need to prove myself to her anymore. I had done everything I could, and I had done it for me, not for her. The trip had shown me something about myself I hadn't fully realized before. I wasn't just Vincent's wife. I wasn't just a mother. I was Isabel, a woman who could stand on her own, no matter what anyone else thought. The weeks following our return were quiet. Simone didn't suddenly shower me with affection, nor did she start treating me like I was her best friend. But I could tell there was a shift. The barbs were fewer. The critical comments were less frequent. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And that, for me, felt like progress. I've come to realize that sometimes, the best way to deal with difficult relationships isn't through grand gestures or desperate attempts at approval. Sometimes, it's simply about standing your ground and showing that you won't back down. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's proving to yourself that you can handle the pressure, that you can rise above it, and that you are worth respecting, not because of what you've done, but because of who you are. And for me, that trip to Paris was the moment I stopped waiting for Simone's approval and started giving myself the credit I deserved. As the weeks passed, the changes in my relationship with Simone didn't come with any fireworks. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden breakthroughs. But there was a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement that things were different now. I could feel it in the way she spoke to me at family gatherings. There were fewer moments of veiled criticism. Her tone, while still sharp at times, wasn't quite as cutting as before. It was as if she had come to accept that I wasn't going anywhere, and, maybe for the first time, she was willing to accept me as I was, flaws and all. It wasn't that I expected us to suddenly become close, or that I was hoping for her approval in everything I did. It wasn't about changing her opinion of me, it was about my perception of her. For so long, I had struggled with the idea of being good enough in her eyes, always trying to live up to expectations I wasn't sure I even understood. But the trip to Paris had changed that. I had taken control of something that mattered to me, something that I had put my heart into. And that gave me a sense of peace, a quiet confidence that I hadn't had before. One Sunday, we were all gathered at Vincent's childhood home for a family dinner. The usual crowd was there: Vincent, his sister Amelie, her husband, and the kids. Simone was at the head of the table, as always, her presence commanding but not domineering. I was setting the table when she walked over to me. I was expecting a usual remark about how the silverware should be arranged differently or how the tablecloth wasn't quite right, but instead, she surprised me. "You've been quiet lately," she said, almost too casually, her eyes flickering over to where I was arranging the wine glasses. "Is everything all right?" I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Was this a trick? Was she testing me again? But instead of second-guessing, I looked her in the eye and simply nodded. "Everything's fine," I said, with a small smile. "Just thinking." Simone didn't press the matter further, but the conversation lingered with me. She hadn't criticized me. She hadn't even made one of her typical remarks. It was unexpected. Dinner that night was uneventful in the best way possible. We ate, we laughed, we talked about the kids' school projects and Amelie's upcoming vacation plans. But there was something different in the air, an underlying calm that hadn't been there before. For once, Simone didn't look at me as the outsider. We were just two people sharing a meal, and that in itself was a small victory. The next few weeks passed with more of these small moments. There were still hints of Simone's old self, her sharp critiques about Vincent's choices in interior design or her disapproval of modern parenting methods, but they no longer felt as biting. She would make her usual comments, but I no longer felt the need to defend myself or react. I had found a new sense of strength that didn't rely on her approval. It was liberating. One afternoon, Vincent and I were sitting in our living room when he brought up something I hadn't expected. "You know, Mom mentioned something interesting the other day," he said, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. "She said she was glad you planned that trip to Paris." I raised an eyebrow. "She did?" "Yeah," he said, looking up at me with a slight grin. "She said it wasn't just a vacation. She said it was the first time she really saw you, you know, for who you are. Not just as my wife or the mother of our kids. She said she respected how you handled it, how you took charge." I sat back, stunned. Simone had actually said that? The woman who had spent years making me feel inadequate, the woman who had always seemed like a looming shadow over our marriage, had said she respected me? "Are you serious?" I asked, a little breathless. Vincent chuckled at my reaction. "I'm serious. I think she's finally seeing you as your own person. You've made an impact on her, Isabel." For a moment, I felt a rush of emotions: relief, disbelief, pride. I hadn't expected Simone to ever acknowledge me in such a way, and yet, she had. It wasn't a grand declaration of love or affection, but it was the first real acknowledgement of my place in the family. And honestly, I was content with that. Over the next few months, Simone and I had more moments like that, little exchanges where we finally seemed to speak on equal terms. It wasn't perfect. We still had our differences, she still wasn't fond of some of my parenting choices, and I still didn't share her fascination with extravagant things like designer handbags or high-end fashion. But we were no longer locked in that perpetual power struggle. I could feel the difference in the way Vincent looked at me, too. It was as if, by standing up for myself, I had finally gained a place in his heart that had been hard-won. For years, he had watched me try to appease Simone, try to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife. But when I pushed back, when I finally stopped trying to please her all the time, he seemed to appreciate me more, not just as his partner, but as someone who had her own strength. I saw it in the way he looked at me when we were out with friends, the way he quietly supported me when we were making decisions about our future. Then came the day when Simone invited me to go shopping with her. It wasn't a grand gesture by any means, but it felt monumental. Simone had never invited me to do anything one-on-one, and the thought of spending hours together in a store was intimidating, to say the least. But I accepted. I wasn't sure what would come of it, but I knew it was another opportunity to test the waters of this new dynamic. We walked through the upscale boutiques of Paris, Simone showing me the pieces she liked, offering her advice on what to wear, which brands were in, and which were out. I still felt that old anxiety rising within me, but this time I wasn't focused on impressing her. I was simply there with her, present, and not trying to win her approval. At one point, as we were trying on shoes in a store, Simone turned to me and said, "I think you've come a long way, Isabel." I didn't expect it. "But you've proven yourself." There it was. The words I had longed to hear, and yet they came so quietly, so matter-of-factly, that I almost didn't register them at first. She wasn't suddenly warm or affectionate, but in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Simone had accepted me. Not because I was perfect, or because I had earned her affection, but because I had simply stopped trying so hard. And that was when I truly realized that the trip to Paris hadn't just been about her seeing me differently. It had been about me seeing myself differently. For so long, I had defined myself by her expectations, her criticisms, and the need to gain her approval. But in standing up for myself, in asserting my worth, I had found something deeper, something Simone couldn't take from me. We left the store that afternoon in silence, but it wasn't the kind of uncomfortable silence I was used to. It felt different, more like a quiet understanding between us. She didn't need to say anything more. I knew she had seen me in a new light. And maybe, just maybe, I had seen her in a new light, too. As the weeks turned into months, the changes between Simone and me were subtle, but they weren't just about our relationship anymore. Something had shifted in me. I had stopped seeking validation from her. I had stopped caring so much about what she thought of me, and that sense of freedom allowed me to breathe in ways I hadn't before. The tension that had built up over years, between us and within myself, was slowly dissipating. It wasn't that Simone suddenly became the mother-in-law of my dreams, offering unsolicited hugs or words of praise. No, that wasn't going to happen. But the days of trying to live up to her expectations, of constantly trying to prove myself, were over. And somewhere deep down, I felt a peace that I hadn't felt in years. Simone's approach to me, though still somewhat guarded, had softened. She no longer found ways to make snide remarks or passive-aggressive comments. The barbs had dulled. She still had her moments, where she'd look at me with that sharp eye, ready to criticize, but they were fewer and farther between. I was no longer intimidated by her presence. She had once made me feel small, but now, I held my own. And that's when I realized it, the real victory wasn't about the trip to Paris. It wasn't about proving anything to Simone. It wasn't even about the few compliments I'd received or the quiet acknowledgement of my efforts. The real victory was in the power I had taken back, in the confidence I had found in myself. The trip had been the catalyst, but it was me standing up for myself, not just to Simone, but to everyone, including myself, that had changed everything. Then came the next test. One evening, about 6 months after the trip, Vincent and I were having dinner with his parents at their house. It was a typical Sunday night, everyone gathered around the table, the kids running in and out of the kitchen. We had gotten used to the rhythm of these family dinners, but there was always that underlying tension with Simone. And while I had learned to let a lot of her comments slide, there were still moments when she would slip into her old habits, small criticisms here and there. But this time, something was different. Simone turned to me mid-conversation and, in her usual tone, said, "You know, Isabel, you should really think about your career. You're always focused on the kids, but there are more important things than just staying at home. It was the kind of thing she'd said before, as if trying to push me into something she thought was more appropriate. Instead of feeling the familiar sting in my chest, I looked at her and smiled. Actually, I'm happy with where I am right now, I said calmly. The kids are my priority, but I'm also working on something for myself. I've been learning some new skills, thinking about a few projects that could keep me busy. I'm not just focused on one thing anymore. I've found my own balance. Simone didn't respond immediately, her lips pressing together into a thin line. But I could see the shift in her eyes. She wasn't used to hearing me talk like this. I wasn't pleading for her approval, I wasn't shrinking from her words. I was simply standing my ground. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but as Vincent and I were getting ready to leave, Simone walked over to me. I heard about your new plans, she said, her voice surprisingly neutral. You know, you've always been a little too distracted by the little things. But I'll give you credit. You seem to be finding your own way. Her words weren't an apology, but they didn't need to be. They were an acknowledgement. And for me, that was enough. A few months later, when Vincent and I decided to renovate our house, we took on a bigger project than we had ever attempted before. We hired a contractor, but it was clear from the start that the plans would need a lot of oversight. As we walked through the house, discussing paint colors and design details, Simone came over to help, as she always did. But this time, there was no hovering, no second-guessing my decisions. For the first time, she let me take the reins, without stepping in and offering unsolicited advice. And, just as I had hoped, I made decisions that worked, decisions I was proud of. When the project was finally complete, I looked at the house, at the place where my family and I would live for years, and realized that I had built something for myself. Not just the house, but the life I was living. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. That day, when we had a small family gathering at the house to celebrate the renovation, Simone took me aside. She didn't say much, just a soft smile and a nod. But it was the quiet recognition that spoke louder than any words. It wasn't until much later that I realized how far things had come between Simone and me. There had been no dramatic reconciliation, no heartfelt moment where she apologized for years of judgment. There had been no sudden shift in our dynamic where we became best friends. What had really changed was that I had stopped trying to earn her approval. I had stopped allowing her to make me feel like I wasn't good enough. I had stopped seeking her approval in every decision I made. Instead, I began to focus on my own happiness, my own strengths, and my own growth. And slowly, over time, Simone began to see that. Not through grand gestures, but through the quiet moments, when I asserted myself, when I made decisions with confidence, when I didn't shrink under her gaze. The real victory came not from changing her, but from changing how I viewed myself. I had taken the trip to Paris, learned French, and stood up to Simone with one simple phrase, and that had been enough. In doing that, I had found the power that had always been within me. Years later, I still think back on that trip to Paris. It wasn't just a vacation. It was the moment I stopped hiding, the moment I learned to stand tall. I hadn't gotten revenge in the traditional sense. There were no outbursts, no cruelty. But sometimes, the best revenge is simply living your life on your own terms, not letting anyone else's judgments define you. Sometimes, the real victory is realizing that you never needed anyone's approval in the first place. And in the end, it wasn't about Simone. It was about me. I had taken back my power, and that was all the revenge I needed.